Hi, Kelley.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You are Kelley Vlahos, the host of the new foreign policy podcast, Trip the Beltway Fantastic, a podcast title whose origins I would like to delve into at some point in this conversation. You're also a senior advisor for the Quincy Institute and editorial director of Quincy's media outlet, responsible Statecraft. Now, the podcast is not a Quincy production. It's your own thing, but the Quincy affiliation is relevant to what we're going to talk about today because Quincy is well known for bringing together people on the left and the right who favor more military restraint by the U.S. In its foreign policy. You are on the right side, I think it's fair to say, right of center. And one thing we're going to talk about today is what kind of foreign policy we could expect from a Trump administration. If there is one, and you're better suited to opine on that than I am. And there was an episode of your podcast that people should check out that was relevant to that, where you had Jim Antle of the Washington Examiner and Kurt Mills of the American Conservative. So before we talk about Trump, talk about the title of this podcast.
Well,
Trip the Beltway Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of classic movies and a student of the past, and I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase "trip the light fantastic," which in the 1920s, when somebody wanted to say, "Hey, let's go dancing," they say, "Let's trip the light fantastic."
Mm-hmm.
And this was carried over through the ages, and I thought it was a great spin on that old 1920s phrase because we're going to be talking about tons of stuff that's happening inside the Beltway in a, I guess, more skeptical fashion. But that is the focus is Washington policy, Beltway policy inside for people outside the Beltway who are trying to figure out why Washington is so broken, messed up, swampy, whatever you want to call it. And so what I hope to do is have people come on the show with all sorts of varying degrees of expertise who kind of are focused on basically pulling up the rock, seeing what's crawling around underneath. I don't want to give platforms to the usual Beltway blobs and establishmentarians, but those who are taking a skeptical view and also might have fun and quirky views about U.S. foreign policy. I mean, we'll talk about everything from what's going on in the Middle East today, all the way to conspiracies, UFOs, whatever, and everything in between. Just basically adhering to the idea that nothing what you see is the final story. There's always something going on beneath. Yeah. So I know a lot of cliches there, but
that's basically in fact, later in the conversation, I want to talk about another episode of your podcast that had Brett Hines, who had written about, along with Ben Freeman, a program that sounds really insidious, I gotta say, and I want to get to that. It's something that I would say could potentially have two different kinds of corrupting influences on American military officers. And my father was a military officer. I grew up around the Army, and so I'm kind of especially sensitive to that and to some ways that I think things have changed, not necessarily for the better. In terms of cultural influences on the military. Now, you're right. I had heard the phrase tripping the light fantastic. You know what, though? All my life, I had thought it was some kind of 60s LSD reference. I really had. I just heard the phrase.
Because it sounds like it, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And you can mix that in. I mean, just have like kind of a crazy episode where you've totally lost contact with reality. But I looked it up last night, was shocked to find that the term actually goes all the way back to John Milton. I don't know if you looked into the etymology, but it's this obscure piece of poetry that got morphed and jumbled into that phrase.
That 1920s reference. So I'm not even correct. It's going way back. I do like the 60s reference, though. The 60s reference actually makes a lot of sense, because sometimes I feel like when I'm looking at the news on current events, I feel like I'm tripping on acid, because it's just so wild. Like nothing is what it seems. And it's like a bizarro world every day when you open up the newspaper, so to speak. And so maybe that's even the better.
I think you should embrace this dimension of the meaning of your podcast title,
Yes.
and every once in a while credit me,
Okay.
should you feel inclined. You know. So on this Trump thing, actually, let me preface this with a more kind of abstract question. When I think of people on the right who favor more military restraint, I actually think of two groups. I think of libertarians and the Cato Institute, for example. We've long seen that emphasis on restraint represented by some people at Cato, libertarian think tank. But then there's also the Buchananite conservatives, as in Pat Buchanan, and they are not libertarians in some ways. I mean, they might, well, yeah, actually, even on an economic front, they tend not to be pure libertarians. Certainly on a cultural front, they tend not to be. Now, did you used to be at the American Conservative, which was the magazine associated with Buchanan? Yes. Okay. Yes. So that's kind of, do you see that as your lineage?
Well, this is the thing, Bob. I don't really consider myself on the right. I consider myself an independent in the purest sense, with a ton of empathy for conservative values and interests. And so it puts me in a very interesting position as a journalist and as the editor of a magazine, and working at the Quincy Institute, which is trying to maintain a transpartisan mission, and having that sort of experience working at the American Conservative, and also working at organizations more center left as well. But I came to the American Conservative writing for them in 2007, during the high point of the insurgency and the war in Iraq, finding that because that magazine had been started in opposition to the Iraq war, that it was a home for writers who had nowhere else to go to talk skeptically about the war. And so I had been working at Fox News as a straight news reporter since 2001, and found that because I had that on my background, no magazines on the left that were being critical of the war policy would entertain having a writer who works at Fox News. And so this was an opening for me, and I found that the folks, and they are paleocons at the American Conservative, were acting as sort of a big tent on this issue. They had libertarians, they had people on the left, they had paleocons, traditional conservatives who were just so outraged with the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East at the time, that they were very welcoming. And so I found a home there. And I mean, personally, I'm independent in that I have views that you would call maybe more progressive libertarian on one hand, more conservative on the other, more progressive even beyond that. So I think because of the empathy that I have found a nice a perch at the Quincy, and really feeling from the core that I could actually help them maintain this transpartisan mission, because it's not easy, and we can talk about that too.
Yeah.
But as far as the American Conservative, yes, they were the only strain of conservatism that had come out foursquare against the global war on terror, the war in Iraq, the 20 years of
no, that was a lonely position, certainly before the Iraq War, because I was opposed to it. It was a pretty lonely position on the left, because I had been at the New Republic, which is kind of left of center, a complicated story, obviously, but pretty much everybody at the New Republic supported the war. And I was at that point writing for Slate. Pretty much everybody at Slate supported the war. That was thought of as left of center. And I remember some people on the left, I forget, it was either Rick Hertzberg or John Judas, said to me at one point, "Boy, the American Conservative has gotten good." Meaning there weren't many outlets they could relate to if they were anti-war. So on this Trump thing, I don't know how. I mean, my starting point is, first of all, I'm not totally on board with even the way he talks about foreign policy, but a lot of what he says about foreign policy does appeal to me because it signals less in the way of use of military force. Other things he says don't signal that. But in any event, I think the conventional wisdom is he talked the talk the first time around, but ultimately the blob engulfed him. You know, he wanted to get troops out of Syria, failed. He wanted to get troops out of Afghanistan, failed. He was probably not enthusiastic about starting to support Ukraine with some weapon shipments. He failed. You know, and well, I went my own. And then there's some things that genuinely worried me that he did that authorized the assassination of this high-ranking Iranian General Soleimani. So anyway, with that as background, what do you think we can expect more in the way of his delivering on the restraint promises that he does make?
You know, I don't think that we can be sure of anything. I think the best we can do is look at the people who are currently maneuvering themselves to be in a future Trump administration. And I think you have clearly have a mixed bag, but on the positive sense, there are a number of people who I would say are in the realist and restraint camp who have been working very closely with other Republican organizations that are serving as a sort of shadow government, or however you call it, government in waiting on the Trump side. And those would be the Project 2025, the Center for Renewing America. Now, they're not all foreign policy, so they're going to be a mixed bag in terms of like the people that they're courting and working with. And there's disagreement on how influential they'll ultimately be. So I'm only giving you my perspective. There's a million different perspectives in this town about who's in and who's out and all that jazz. But I've been heartened because a lot of the people that I work with through Quincy and through the American Conservative Connections, who are gaining some influence in the conservative world, and we will call them the new right, are in a pretty good place. And they have the ear of a lot of people who are working with the Trump people, who are working with leadership in Congress. And they're smart. They have the intellectual firmament of what a realist restrainer would look like. And in many ways, they are more serious and in terms of having the fundamental values of like change, of wanting to change the American foreign policy and how than Trump ever will be. So if those people get into places of power within a Trump White House, I think that we'd be in pretty good shape. Now, if Trump turns around and he starts pulling in neocons and your usual Cold War warrior Republican types like Nikki Haley and others, then you're going to have the same problem that you had in Trump 1, where you had such a mixed bag that it seemed like every foreign policy decision was made on the fly with whoever had the best influence or whoever was the last person to talk to him in the Oval Office on any given occasion.
Okay. So, yeah, I've heard that, you know, and it's reasonable to expect that he will, in general, do a better job of like executing an agenda this time than last time. Honestly, I don't think he thought he was going to win the election last time. I don't think he, you know, I think he started preparing to govern a couple months before taking office. And this time, as you said, you know, these think tanks, there are whole new think tanks that have been started for this purpose. And some of the old line think tanks are preparing people. And you'll think he's going to have a much clearer idea of what he's doing. This, of course, terrifies some people who are worried about the authoritarian side of him on the domestic front. But as for the foreign policy, are there particular think tanks that somebody like you is hoping he'll draw from, and that you're hoping he won't draw from? Like Heritage, for example, is, I guess, getting some people ready. And I assume that on the foreign policy side, you'd rather they sat this one out. Is that right?
This is the thing with heritage. They have come a long way, and for myriad different reasons, towards a more restraint point of view, specifically on Ukraine. So over the last 2 years, their president, Kevin Roberts, has been out there basically talking a restrainer's language, saying that the United States should not be going out in search of monsters to destroy. It shouldn't be spreading its military too thin. We shouldn't be the world's policeman. We should only engage in military intervention when it's in our best interest. And a look at what's happened in the last 20 years does not bear out that those wars were necessarily in our interest. And they focus in on Ukraine and saying we shouldn't be giving any more aid. We should have been basically talking about peace or diplomacy rather from the outset. Instead, we encourage this sort of prolonged war there. And it's almost a mirror image of what we're talking about at Quincy.
Yeah, that's a whole new world for heritage. I mean,
it is. But
just a quick footnote. Anatole Levin, who is at Quincy, and is kind of a realist. He wrote a book called Ethical Realism. If I remember correctly, his co-author was at that point at Heritage, but had to leave Heritage because of the kind of neocon turn they were taking. So this would be another turn. But go ahead.
Oh yeah, what I was going to say, the but was that their policy on China is still very aggressive. Their policy on the Pentagon budget is still very U.S. primacy focused, and so they haven't changed that. If you look at their briefs, their substantive work on these issues, they are still very hawkish. And so, as much as I give credit to the turn in rhetoric and the fact that they have distanced themselves from the neocon apparatus, at least superficially. I like what Kevin Roberts is saying. I wouldn't trust that they would be restrainers on all of the issues, and certainly not on Iran. And that's where you're going to find a lot of disparity. It's over China and it's over Iran. I would say there are groups like American Moment, which you might not have heard of, and they are in the more new right vein. They came up just over the last, say, 5 years, young conservatives, very much focused on more of a very pro America first in terms of economy, very pro competing with China, sort of disentangling some of the supply chains and building, I would say, a defense or just an industrial policy writ large, but also very restrained on foreign policy. And so I feel like the people associated with them, the people associated with Cato, Quincy, the American conservative, are folks that you would want to see in places in the State Department, the National Security Council,
So to be clear, the American Moment people they are in favor of delinking to some extent from China economically and so on, but they are not militarily aggressive toward China. Okay,
exactly. Well, and this is where it gets complicated in our restraint camp, and I'm all for talking about it and working it out, because I feel like on Ukraine we all seem to be on the same page, not so much on China. And I feel like that there is varying degrees of how much of a threat that these folks on the right feel China is. And then beyond that, do they want to be aggressive about it militarily, or is it just the economic competition that they want to see through? And there are plenty of us who say, okay, we're going to be clear-eyed about China and the economic threat that it might pose to America, but we don't want to get in a war about it. So how do we do both? Stay out of war, but maintain American interests abroad economically. And then there are those who are a little bit more hawkish, like Elbridge Colby, who is a realist.
Right.
And, he says a lot of things that
Very,
I agree with.
very hawkish on China, right?
Like
There
hawkish
is
on
there
China.
is this strand of realists. I think you and I would both identify with certain parts of realism. I mean, I've written about progressive realism, and but I'm not a China hawk. I don't think you are. But Mearsheimer is pretty hardcore, and just I wasn't sure whether this Colby guy qualifies as a realist or was kind of a neocon in disguise or what, but he's very hawkish on China. And he's often mentioned as this thought leader in future Republican circles. Alarming.
Well, and this is the thing, and I have nothing against Elbridge Colby, and he has been actually pretty welcoming to Quincy. We disagree. And Mearsheimer is a non-resident fellow of long in good standing with Quincy. I think they will tell you that they don't want to go to war with China either. And I feel like this is where the line goes, how aggressive can you get until it becomes a provocation? There are people in the United States Congress who I would not call realists. I would just call them plain old hawks who I believe actually want to go to war with China, and every move they make is a provocation to get us closer to that point. I think that there is a lot of nuance in what Mearsheimer and Colby and others are advocating for. So it's very complicated, and I feel like we need to keep talking about it and not just get into disparate camps and say, well, you want war and you don't. And, I feel like on the right, this is a conversation we absolutely need to have, because I honestly don't think that we are going to get anywhere in changing U.S. foreign policy until the right and left can work together. And it's just, we have to sort of kind of work to reconcile some of those differences, or at least, be in a place where we can continue to advocate for restraint, and still maintain our individual integrity on our positions. That's not easy. It makes my job very difficult. It's, but well, I
was going to say, can you, in terms of people who you think really do want war with China, which strikes me as flat out crazy, but can you name names or not?
Well, I would say Mike Pompeo, John Bolton. Like, I would never want to see them in office in another administration again. Yeah. But if you said, oh, well, what if John Mearsheimer was going to be, Secretary of State? I'd say, hell yeah. I mean, I don't agree with him on China, but he's a reasonable man. He doesn't want to go to war. And I would, even if you said, what would you rather have, Elbridge Colby or Mike Pompeo? I'd take Elbridge Colby in a second, because I feel like he's a smarter person. And I feel like, yes, we disagree on this realist approach, but I too don't think he wants to go to war with China. I don't get that same. I get a more ideological vibe from people like Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Lindsey Graham, a lot of these guys and gals who I feel like they don't have the intellectual chops, and they are more ideological about their foreign policy, which makes me nervous.
Yeah. I like John Mearsheimer. I've had him on my podcast a couple of times, and if people want to watch me kind of debate him about China, it's out there on YouTube. But I'm not championing him as Secretary of State because I'm so worried about China. I agree, he doesn't want a war, but usually wars are started by people who said they didn't want wars. That's the way they happen. It's through miscalculation and unwise assertiveness. What about this guy Pottinger? Now, he probably won't wind up in the Trump administration because he so thoroughly separated himself from Trump after January 6th. But I'm curious. Matthew
I don't know
Pottinger,
too much about him, so I can't.
Yeah, he was in the last Trump administration, and he's a China hawk, and he's always worried me.
The thing with the China experience in the Trump administration, and I remember, and I can't remember who wrote the piece, but it was really insightful because Trump had he had fealty to many of his donors, including like Sheldon Adelson, who had business interests in China. and did not want him to start a trade war or a military war. And so they're sitting on this shoulder saying, keep everything open, stop your provocations. And then you had on the other side, the real neocon and hawk element who just wanted to shut everything down, pro-trade war, pro-military provocation. And I feel like it could go either way during that first administration. And I don't see how that would be different. I just get this feeling that Trump he is in dire need of money. We all know that. And so he's going to have a lot of the top donors in the Republican Party are very hawkish. They're super hawkish on Israel, super hawkish on Iran. Maybe I don't know about the China issue with the two angels and devil on each shoulder, but I just feel that he is going to feel more responsible to donors, maybe even in this cycle than he was in his first in 2016 because of all of his legal problems. He's got to raise money like mad.
Yeah. Now in China, there's the fact that as a matter of domestic politics, he tends to get his constituency revved up about China. I mean, for starters, they took the jobs. And of course, economic competition with China did take a toll on some American jobs. But he's got that. And he kind of played the pandemic that way. So to some extent, I worry that momentum will carry over into military strategy in the Pacific. But in a way, I worry more about Iran. I mean, my big concern in terms of disastrous wars breaking out are like Russia, Ukraine, Iran, and China. Although and Iran, I guess Middle East broadly, since at this point the actual, the where exactly the flames spread to first is complicated with this war in Gaza and everything. Yeah. But as you said, Iran is a target for a lot of people on the right. I mean, especially pro-Israel people. And it seems to me that Trump seemed less conflicted about pleasing them in his first term than he did about pleasing China hawks, right? China was complicated. With Israel, he did pretty much everything he was asked to do, right? He moved the embassy. He assassinated Soleimani. To me, that's very alarming. And this is the thing about Trump, is I worry that he's got a little Bolton in him in the sense that he'll just go reckless all of a sudden. He was very lucky to get out of that without a war, I think, because, I mean, Iran very much didn't want a war, but they did feel they had to respond forcefully. So they lobbed missiles at these American barracks, and I gather conveyed word to the U.S. via Iraq that they were going to do this. So it moved all the soldiers out of the barracks, but a lot of things could have gone wrong. I mean, as it was, the U.S. soldiers in the bomb shelter got concussions, even though the missiles didn't hit the bomb shelter. And if one had gone astray and hit the bomb shelter, it would have been very hard politically to not do something that led to war. This just worries me a lot. That was a completely gratuitous, crazy thing to do. Assassinate Soleimani, if you ask me. It is a good example of something that I think Biden wouldn't have done, Trump did do. And that worries me. Anyway, there's a long-winded way of saying that Iran really worries me in a Trump administration.
Yeah. And just a caveat on that, they did, evacuate the barracks, and there was that limited strike. Then there was this space of time where it could have went either way. Trump could have hit hard back. And I and Danny Davis and Doug McGregor were all on Fox News on one after another on Tucker Carlson's show that night, basically making the case as to why Trump needs to hold back, show restraint, and not get in a full-on war with Iran. And major newspapers actually credited Tucker Carlson for clawing that back or calming Trump down and convincing him to just let that limited strike stand and then let's move on. And so there was a tug and pull even at that time. And folks that say that Tucker Carlson has just been, a restrainer or against war because of Ukraine, because he loves Putin. If you listen to Tucker, he has fundamental restraint values that he has been espousing way before the Ukraine invasion. And he does reflect this schism on the right over foreign policy. Again, he had Trump's ear at that very moment. I absolutely agree with you, Bob, that Iran is the flashpoint that, gives me a headache when I'm trying to bring this transpartisan thing together, because you not only have this age-old animosity that's baked into the Washington establishment against Iran. I mean, it's a bias that is so fully entrenched. It's worse than the anti-Russia sentiment here. So you have that baked into the establishment. Then you have the neoconservatives and all of the money, the pro-Israel money that is being poured into campaigns all the way up to the presidential campaigns, where they do not see a difference between being pro-Israel and wiping out Iran. And that it is so clear when you look at even Biden's top campaign donors. We had a story on Responsible Statecraft by Eli Clifton, where he said that at least 1/3 of all of Biden's top campaign donors that have donated to his victory fund, that means everybody that has pledged over $900,000 are rabidly pro-Israel. And within their agendas is you got to get Iran.
And the crazy thing about this is, I mean, maybe I'm just confused, but it seems to me that so many of the things that I consider destructive that are favored by, pro-Israel people, not necessarily in the broad sense of the term, but the kind of, the more hawkishly pro-Israel, I don't even think they're good for Israel. I mean, so many things about Israeli policy that I think are bad are good for politically, maybe for the Israeli leadership. It's great for Bibi Netanyahu to always have this existential enemy that he can scare people about. This is a general thing about leaders. And it's good for the leader of Iran that if his people can worry about Israel, and it's good. It's like the extreme leaders are always playing a non-zero sum game with each other, and they're not necessarily serving their nation's interests. Like, I don't think what Israel's been doing in Gaza is good for Israel in the long run. They're just creating the next generation of people who want to kill Israeli civilians. And because these will be people whose siblings and cousins were killed by Israel. This is the way it works. And it's just frustrating that rapprochement with Iran, I think, would be in the interest of the actual nation of Israel and the nation of the United States. And when, the closest thing that region has come to that, in a way, was orchestrated by China, right? A kind of a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Right.
And I think Biden is trying to undo that, right? His revival of the whole kind of Abraham Accords momentum. And some people think that whole drive from Trump's Abraham Accords to, Biden's following through on it led to October. I don't know whether it did or not lead to the Hamas attack, but there are people who think it didn't. And I think that, to some extent, from Biden's perspective, is a way of countering China. No, right. China wants a stable, peaceful Middle East. No, we can't let China have its way. I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sure you.
No, I agree with what's most upsetting about this is that our foreign policy is being driven by very narrow interests at the top. And those narrow interests, at least if you follow the money, are very anti-Iran and very pro-Israel. And I think if you ask the American people whether or not they want to go to war with Iran, they'll say, what? Not, why? No, I guess so, because somebody on a radio told me, or a podcast told me, or Fox News has told me, but they don't really know exactly why or how Iran threatens America. They I've been, I'm around for a while, and they're still using this trope that Iran is the biggest funder of terrorism in the world. And I don't know where I know where that comes from, and I think that comes from like decades ago. And I'm sure that they're lumping in Hezbollah and Hamas and calling them terrorists, but it seems so shop worn to me. And because there are no specific examples of Iran actually invading other countries or bombing other countries, I mean, they have done less than the United States did in the last 20 years in terms of interventions, but they are being raised up as this evil scourge. And there's not much to back it up at this point, but the American people are being told this, but they're being told by very narrow special interests who have major influence over our White House, past and present, Congress, both parties, the establishment in Washington. And that's pretty dangerous because that means we're always on a constant war footing with a country where we can't really explain why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, of course, Iran definitely funds Hamas and Hezbollah. I think people underestimate the extent to which, I think they overestimate the extent to which that comes out of some like religious ideological imperative, although there's probably some of that, and underestimate the extent to which it's Israel just kind of playing for the hearts and minds of the regional Arab public, right? And B, actual strategy. I mean, Iran, to an extent that people don't understand, feels very insecure. It suffered a devastating war at the hands of Iraq. The U.S. support was on Iraq's side. Yep. So, of course, when the U.S. invades Iraq and wants to set up a permanent presence there, you can bet that Iran is going to try to dislodge those troops and get their proxies to kill some of those troops to get them out, and is going to have some proxies because Iraq is a majority Shia nation. And so, Iran is going to be able to cultivate some support. It's just all completely predictable as something that a nation with that history would do. And it's always cast as, Iran is just for reasons we don't understand. They just want to kill everybody.
That's right. It came out of nowhere. It's in a vacuum. Nobody talks about the Iran-Iraq war. They don't talk about how we took a passenger jet out of the sky and killed hundreds of civilians. Oops, it was a mistake. We never apologized for it. Sunk their ships. I mean, this was an active engagement between the U.S. and Iran. This didn't come out of nowhere. And the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah also have civil bodies where they're actually they're running governments. I may not like that. You might not like that, but it's more complicated than just saying that they're funding these terrorist organizations. These terrorist organizations are deeply ingrained in the governments of both Lebanon and Gaza, and to act as though that, like you said, that this was just purely ideological force that needs to be stopped is just is oversimplifying to the greatest extent. And it does such a disservice to the American people because, like I said, they just end up believing whatever they hear and acquiescing when we really should be putting our foot down and saying this is not in our best interest, not in Israel's best interest, and not in Iranians' best interest. But unfortunately, I don't see this getting any better with a new Trump administration at all. And that is going to, like you said, Bob, that's going to be the real sticky wicket there, no matter how restrained. Like if you have a J.D. Vance come in, say, as a vice president or state secretary of state, for example, he's really good on Ukraine. He seems to be pretty good overall on ending endless wars and clawing back this whole idea of U.S. primacy. But you ask him about Iran and you ask him about Israel, I think he'll be as hawkish as the rest. And so it is definitely going to be a mixed bag.
Yeah. I want to elaborate on something I said. I mean, when I said that the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that China kind of tried to orchestrate with some success, would be a good thing we should welcome and be stabilizing. I mean, I recognize that Israel finds it threatening, but I really think that's kind of a miscalculation. I mean, because for one thing, as I said, one reason for Iran's anti-Israel policy is actually insecurity about threats from the Sunni Arab world. It's part of that larger game. It's not the only source of Iranian hostility to Israel, but I think if you got rid of that, it wouldn't hurt. And just more broadly, I just see that one fissure between like Iran, Syria, Russia to some extent, off in the distance on the one hand, and then, you know, kind of our Arab allies, Israel and so on. That seems to me the most dangerous fault line. And if China wants to start healing that, I think that's probably progress. Now, on the Middle East, one thing that's worrying me lately is that I think we'll see what happens with this, the possibility of a ceasefire that seems to be still in play to some extent at the moment. But I worry that Bibi Netanyahu, I mean, obviously he wants to keep the war going so he can stay in office, although his approval numbers are going up, and that may not be as necessary as it once was, keeping the war going for his political purposes. But another thing that worries me is that he's kind of playing for time because he thinks, and I believe correctly, that Trump would give him a freer hand in Gaza up to and include, not just to occupy and annex, but including even the wholesale ethnic cleansing of Gaza. I've got to think. I mean, don't you think Bibi believes that Trump will be more amenable to all that stuff? And B, that he may be right? Or do you, what do you think?
Again, we don't know, so we kind of got to look for clues. One of the most pernicious clues that came out earlier on, and maybe not so much earlier, but I think it was about 2 or 3 months ago, that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was interviewed, I believe, I want to say by Harvard, some Harvard program, and it was on video. And he basically said that there won't be anything left in Gaza. And the question was, well, aren't you, the question was, people are concerned that if Palestinians are brought elsewhere, and I think the conversation was about refugees and whether to try to settle them somewhere else until the war is over, yada, yada. And he said, well, there's going to be nothing left for them anyway back there in Gaza, intimating that he'd be happy if they were all cleansed out of there and there was just rubble that they could, and he literally said that there's tons of beachfront property that can be used that's not being used at the present time. And so you had this guy who, was the chief architect of the Abraham Accords, basically, and son-in-law of Trump, signaling that he'd be happy if the Palestinians were driven from Gaza and that it would just be, razed to the ground and rebuilt in some fashion where like he can move in with other real estate moguls and start selling off beachfront property. To me, that was a moment that, at least for me, that was a moment. And I said, well, we don't know much about what Trump is thinking about Israel, because he's given a lot of interviews where you could go either way in terms of what he was thinking and saying. But his son-in-law seems to be pretty clear about what kind of future there might be for Gaza. And that makes me nervous.
Yeah. Kushner complained that the media had left out some qualifiers that he said after he said what he said, but so people can go back and check. But it's just so weird that you'd bring up the value of the beachfront property in Gaza at this point. I mean, and who doubts that? Oh my God, I just couldn't believe. Who doubts that that Trump may be thinking that way? I mean, it's not completely crazy. Well, to imagine a Trump hotel there someday, honestly. I mean, but anyway, I worry about that. I think the whole Israel, Middle East, Iran thing is the place where Trump is most predictable. because he showed it last time, and he's not going to encounter a lot of resistance from the blob.
I have a one I tend to agree with you there, but because Trump is so mercurial, he had some real flashes of anger against Netanyahu because Netanyahu, I think, congratulated Biden after the 2020 election. And I don't think Trump ever got over it. Big surprise. But there are also moments during their relationship that we used to call a bromance, in which he didn't really give. I felt like Netanyahu was using Trump during all of his campaigning, and there were billboards of the two. But I think there were a few moments where Trump kind of held back. Now, people laugh at me and say, Kelley, he gave them everything they wanted, and he did. But I just wouldn't count out that if something happened during his presidency in Israel that would threaten Trump personally or his popularity at home, that he wouldn't put up the hand and just and stop. I don't know what that would mean, but I feel like he values his own self, his own popularity with the people, his own survival in the White House more than he does his relationship with Netanyahu. I don't know where the break might be, but I wouldn't necessarily believe that he would give him an ultimate free hand. I could be wrong. I would eat my hat tomorrow. Maybe
I mean,
Trump projecting and not wanting to see that.
He is ultimately pretty opportunistic in his relationships. I can see him becoming buddies with Bibi again overnight if it made sense for him. But the other thing I'd say is that if we assume that he's accepting that this would be his last term, and I know there are people worried that he's not accepting that, even though that's what the Constitution says, then he wouldn't be so concerned about donations once he's in office as concerned as he was last time. And that changes some calculations, because I think one thing about Trump, there are people who like, hey, you gave me that donation. I feel appreciative. I will show my appreciation.
Yeah.
And even though I don't need the donation anymore, I don't think Trump's like that. I think he gets what he wants out of you. He's happy to cut you off at the knees. And that may in some ways be good in this context. I don't know.
Yeah, we still don't know the extent of how much he wanted personally, because of his own values, to give Israel everything that it wanted, including recognizing the capital in Jerusalem and the Golan Heights as Israel, and cutting off Palestinian aid, and everything down the line. We don't know if that was Trump because he really believed in his fiber, about it, or it was because he had made promises to Sheldon Adelson and all of these big donors, along the way up to that point. And we know Sheldon Adelson, that was one of the things that he wanted before he died, was to see that capital move to Jerusalem. And he was the biggest donor behind the Republicans and Trump that year, 2016. It's so hard to parse out, how much is Trump and how much is just, like you said, like he's, it's transactional for him.
Yeah.
And he has his son-in-law whose family is deeply related to the cause of the settlers in the West Bank, and Netanyahu is a family friend. We don't know how tight and intricate those relationships are in his own family.
Yeah, I don't know. And you don't know, would Jared be as prominent in this administration as he was last time around? And then on Ukraine, we've talked a little about it. I think that's the area where I think it's most likely you could have what I'd consider a happy outcome, which is Trump just cutting a deal, which, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post in December 2022. It was right after Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, had said, this may be as good as it's going to get on the ground. Maybe we should do a deal. I don't know if he said explicitly Ukraine's going to have to concede some territory, but reality's reality. anyway, I said, largely echoed him with a slightly different argument in December. And look, Milley was right. If you look at the timeline, that was exactly the time to cut a deal. All that's happened since is Ukrainians dying and Russians dying, and lately Ukrainians starting to lose appreciable amounts of land. And I do think I don't know why I don't know why they didn't take Milley more seriously. For one thing, maybe they feared the blob, but I do think you could expect that Trump would say, let's call it a day. And as unsatisfactory as that is in many ways, because Russia would be rewarded for transborder aggression, for violating international law, which I'm really not happy about. At this point, I don't see anything that's better coming out of this. And I do think Trump he might well get that done. Don't you think?
I think the dynamics are much more favorable than anything that's going on in Gaza right now, which I feel like we have a certain amount of control over that situation. We have leverage. We haven't used it, but it's limited. I think Netanyahu is going to do what he and his government want to do. Whereas in Ukraine, we have this serious leverage in terms of funding the war. Zelensky is desperate for more weapons, more trainers, more men to fight. We can't give them the men, we can't give them the trainers and weapons, but there's only so much that we can promise. And our Western partners, they're running out of what they can promise. They promise the moon, but they don't really have it in store. And we're running out our own stockpiles. I think Trump, him laying it out for Zelensky, basically engaging some sort of conversation with Putin, who he already has a relationship, call it what you will, with him. I think he would be inclined to be seen as the peacemaker too, because that's how Trump rolls. He can move in and make a deal. I think it's much more possible, because I do see that you will have some serious reservations from NATO members who seem to want to fight forever. So I'm sure they'll push back and they don't like Trump, but I feel like the winds are behind his back in terms of like the Republican Party in Congress. I think the population, the citizenry here would like to see an end. So I just feel like he's in much better position to like push for something. And like you said, it's not going well for Ukraine. And no one I've talked to actually think it's going to get better, that Ukraine could actually pull out a serious victory, even with all of the help that we just pledged in Congress, that they won't be able to do anything but maybe hold the line. But Russia seems to have learned from its mistakes, and they have just a much more powerful industrial base, and they have more men to throw at this thing.
Yeah, and one thing that has changed in the political climate surrounding this is that the Ukrainian people, I think, are starting to realize they're probably not going to get all their territory back. Back in late 2022, people were saying, well, Biden can't do this because the Ukrainian people just aren't ready to accept it. And I said, well, that's why he should play the bad cop. He should play the heavy. He should allow Zelensky to say sorry, but the Americans are, they said they'd cut off our weapons or something. And, use the leverage to Zelensky's political advantage and Ukraine's geopolitical advantage. But I think in any event, things have changed, and the environment's more auspicious for an actual settlement. So, Kelley, as you know, at some point in these conversations, we generally go into what's called overtime. That part of the conversation is available to paid subscribers of the Nonzero newsletter, which I encourage everyone to become. You've been kind enough to say you'd stick around for that, and I want to talk about a couple of things. One thing I want to do is actually delve a little more into your personal background and how you kind of came to be where you are ideologically. But I also want to discuss that episode of your podcast I mentioned about this, I think, insidious program for, in maybe two senses, corrupting military officers. I don't mean that's the explicit aim or what people had in mind. I just think it has that potential. and talk about random other stuff. But is there anything else you want to say? I mean, of course, you want people to check out your podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Trip to Beltway, fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, as you were so kind to bring me and Daniel Larison on your show when we were running Crashing the War Party. Dan is coming on as a random drive-by host, but this is my first solo foray into the podcast world, and so like I'm really excited about having people all over the map in terms of their knowledge of U.S. foreign policy, but also the corruption of U.S. foreign policy on the show, giving them a chance to talk about it. So we'll be talking about everything in terms of like the war and the military industrial complex, but also the Washington politics that drive our foreign policy in hopes of just sort of exposing like how bad it is in terms of, just the foreign influence, the influence by defense contractors, big donors, dark money, so there's a lot to talk about, but I'm hoping to give people a platform to talk about more these things through an independent lens, an alternative lens than we usually hear through the blob.
Okay. And speaking of Daniel Larison, people should also subscribe to his Substack newsletter. You know me at EUNOMIA. He's great. Thanks to everybody who's listened so far, whether or not you're going to join us in overtime. If you want to join us, you just go to Nonzero Substack. You can click on the post that represents this conversation. And if you become a paid subscriber, you can listen to or watch the whole thing right there. And you can also see there how to set up a podcast feed that'll always entitle you to the overtime segment.
Also, we are also on Substack as well. The Trip the Beltway, fantastic. So, yeah.
Okay, so just everybody should go to Substack and subscribe to at least 3 things. Okay, so now we are heading into overtime.